good morning. I'm Richard Mole. I'm a political sociologist, and my research looks primarily at sexuality and migration, and sort of usually the intersection between the two. I'm particularly interested in, as a sociologist, I'm particularly interested in the sort of the interplay of social forces, social change, and as a political sociologist, sort of interested in the intersection between ideology and sexuality, and also the politicization of homophobia by politicians. And so I was delighted when we sort of saw all of the papers and abstracts coming in, that we were able to create 5 panels looking specifically at issues of LGBT plus sort of politics and the lived experience. And so what I want to do in the next 5 minutes or so is just to sort of provide a background which will probably be sort of more familiar to you as most of you are coming from Poland, so this won't be new for most of you, but nevertheless I thought it would be sort of useful to sort of provide the context for seeing how sort of debates about the place of LGBT people in Poland sort of played out throughout Poland's history. Sort of my initial interest in sort of issues of sexuality came about in sort of looking at the different ways that the different sort of legal position of LGBT people across Central and Eastern Europe during the communist period. And what was sort of particularly striking was, as you all know, that no Polish government had ever introduced a law criminalizing homosexuality. There was a law in Poland, but this was sort of introduced by sort of the occupying powers during the partition period. And so it sort of remained in force for the first decade of the interwar period, but was then sort of abolished in 1932. So uniquely, sort of at least to begin with, homosexuality was not criminalized in Poland during the communist period, but nevertheless, the sort of the meaning attached to it was still sort of negative. It was seen as a sort of an issue of Western depravity. It was used as a means to sort of blackmail and recruit sort of LGBT people as informants, and this sort of really sort of came to the fore with Akcja Hyacynt. And this is sort of explained in sort of great detail in sort of GRL by Krzysztof Tomasik, and more recently in the excellent Transnational Homosexuals in Communist Poland by Łukasz Schulz. And if you haven't bought it yet, I suggest you sort of go to Waterstones at lunchtime and then get Łukasz to sign it for you. So life sort of during the communist period, it wasn't sort of illegal, but was sort of still difficult. And so there was a sort of a lot of expectation when sort of communism collapsed in 1989. But this obviously sort of coincided with a great deal of political and particularly sort of economic upheaval. Sort of inflation sort of shot up immediately after the collapse of communism. Unemployment shot up immediately after the collapse of communism, and so you had a time of sort of great economic, political, and social flux. And at times like these, people sort of are looking for certainties. Whether they agreed with communism or not, communism provided sort of a lot of answers to questions, and it provided a great deal of certainty. That sort of went away after 1989. And so people looked for sort of other ways to sort of provide answers to the big questions. And so this is when sort of nationalism and religion sort of came to the fore, well, even more so than previously. Both nationalism and religion were very good at providing sort of a credible reading of the past and the present and the future. And obviously in Poland's case, both of these two sort of ideologies were sort of very strongly intertwined. And the Catholic Church is very clear in its opposition to same-sex sexuality. It closes the sexual act to the gift of life, whereas nationalists sort of critique it also for sort of not sort of contributing towards the sort of biological and also cultural reproduction of the Polish nation. So when Poland joined the EU, again, this was a sort of moving to the 2000s. This was a sort of a mixed picture. Poland was required to introduce certain laws decriminalizing discrimination in the fields of employment. But other than that, it was sort of used by sort of populist and nationalist politicians as a way of sort of arguing that Poland's national identity was under threat because of the sort of the more secular and seemingly pro-gay policies of the European Union. So again, it was sort of used by politicians to sort of create this idea of the sort of the decadent West and the sort of the traditional Poland. And this was sort of seen, sort of reflected in sort of the banning of pride parades in Warsaw, for example, by Kaczynski. The European Union didn't really help its case. It sort of issued a number, the European Parliament issued a number of sort of communiques criticising the treatment of LGBT people across the EU, but all of its examples came from the former communist countries. So it sort of promoted this idea, this very home and nationalist idea that sort of, you know, we in the West are doing it fine, but you need to sort of catch up, which was sort of very unhelpful. And sort of was seen by sort of Polish politicians as very sort of insulting, and therefore it became a sort of a matter of pride to sort of critique the Poland, the EU's sort of liberal stance on LGBT rights. So as Agnieszka Graf put it, sort of homophobia became the new voice of patriotism. And so all of this sort of has sort of built up and was sort of embraced further by sort of Law and Justice's more recent sort of electoral victories and sort of their increasing populist rhetoric, which has sort of been very hostile towards LGBT Poles. As a result, in terms of sort of legal equality, sort of Poland is sort of one of the three worst sort of in the EU, sort of along with Latvia and Lithuania, although that doesn't translate, or sort of as far as we can see in terms of sort of homophobic rhetoric and violence, they're not doing quite sort of as badly as some of the sort of other countries, sort of the Baltic region, the Balkan region, and Italy, for example, and Greece. But nevertheless, there's sort of very little data on sort of homophobic hate crime in Poland. Although my recent PhD student Piotr Godzisz has just finished his PhD on this, so look out for his name. He will be publishing on this in the near future. So, coming up, so these sort of issues I hope will be sort of discussed in greater detail by those of you sort of presenting on these 5 panels. The first of which will be waves of LGBT plus emancipations in Poland, which will be the first one after this introductory session. So thank you. I'm really looking forward to sort of engaging with you over the next few days, and as Ola said, on reading your full sort of chapters once we sort of get to that stage. So thank you very much. I'll just hand it back over to Ola to sort of finish off.